There's a writer called Freya India. She wrote about this phenomena on social media at the moment, particularly on like TikTok, that is called therapy culture, which is like the modern day's like obsession with viewing life through like your diagnoses and using therapy speak. So like pinning people's behavior to like their ADHD or like their autistic traits or like being a bit OCD, and how these kind of therapy terms, these mental health terms, have become so ingrained into our like lexicon. And like in relationships particularly, you'll describe your relationship with terms like attachment type, or you know, I'm an anxious attachment and he's a secure attachment, or you know, he's an anxious and I'm an insecure, all these kind of things. It's like that world is kind of breached into modern day just general speak, and there are loads of different aspects of social media that are sort of getting across this message, and it's influencing how young people think about the world. But she made this really interesting point in a podcast I listened to with her on it, that therapy culture has massive religious underpinnings, and she posed the theory that the reason it's become quite big is because it satisfies maybe our religious like need and our religious inclination. And she wrote this paragraph that I'm sort of paraphrasing, about to paraphrase, where she said, you know, we no longer pray, but instead we are suggested to repeat positive affirmations, right? We no longer go to confession, but trauma dumping on your friend is something that we say we should be doing or do. We no longer feel like we reach salvation, right, through a religious experience, but we go on our own healing journeys from our trauma. We no longer have to resist temptation from the devil. We have to reframe our intrusive thoughts, right? And we're no longer speaking to God, but we say things like the message we put out to the universe, or putting trust in the universe. And I think she's right in that all of these terms and these phrases that are part of this like movement, I guess, online, do have quite religious underpinnings. And then I thought about this quote that I read by a guy called David Foster Wallace. And he said in a speech that you can find online, I might leave the link in the show notes of this episode, he said, everybody worships, but the only choice we get is what to worship. And an outstanding reason for choosing some sort of god or spiritual type thing to worship is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. And we've talked about it before on the podcast, right? I think we said something, we discussed something in the past that like for a drug addict, heroin or cocaine or their drug of choice is their god. And that makes sense. But what do we really mean by that? Like, is it that our capacity to worship is so deep and ingrained in the human experience that if you don't pick like a higher ethical principle or a higher philosophy to pin that like worshipping inclination to, something worldly gets in the way? Something like money or status and fame or a drug or any kind of addiction or obsession, does that kind of hijack that same drive that we have that was initially sort of satisfied by religion? And that's why I bring Nietzsche into the conversation. When he said that God was dead, he predicted that there would be like mass political indoctrination that would lead to a lot of bloodshed, which he was right in terms of like the 20th century with, you know, Nazism in Germany and the Soviet Union and that all that kind of stuff. But I think God didn't necessarily die. I think he just transfigured, or maybe the religious inclination didn't die. Instead, that moved to other things, and we're not aware of it. Now, I think I'll pause there and see if you have any points, and I have a few more further bits to go on as we go through. But so far, am I making sense, and do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, this is good. I think of immediately one of Peterson's claims on Jubilee was that everyone worships something, even atheists. They just might not know what it is. And I think this therapy culture is something that people could choose. It's a proportion of this is something that people could choose to replace that with. And I think of that because there's links that we all can relate to it. We're all on the spectrum, maybe of a lot of things like mental health, autism to some degree, but it's those that choose to identify with it, that they have been given this by birth, which makes it powerful. And then they have that as their god. And
I think, let me just jump in here because I've seen a note that I wrote to myself that's very important. Freya India's whole point about that about the therapy culture linking to religion thing is in, let's say, Christianity, right? One main theme of Christianity is about self-sacrifice and worshipping something bigger than yourself, and that would give you salvation, right? But the narrative of our culture and of that online world is that you kind of worship yourself in a way. Like it's about your mental health. It's about your appearance or your security in your relationship or your wellness. It's very self-centered. Now that's not necessarily a bad thing because, you have to look after yourself and you can't pour from an empty cup and all that's well and good. But if your overarching like ethical principle to follow to follow in your life is about your like feelings, I don't think that's necessarily going to lead to a great life because your feelings can wane, and I don't necessarily know if you can trust them because they're very sort of instinctual and stuff. And it's so interesting that you mention Peterson's Jubilee statements, because as much as that video gained a lot of, I would say, adequate pushback because of the way that he handled many of the debates in it, I've put here in my notes verbatim, this is why instinctively I agree with statement 1 and 3 that Peterson made in the Jubilee surrounded video. Statement 1 was atheists reject God because they don't understand what they're rejecting. And statement 3 was everybody worships something, even atheists, even though they might not know it. Those two statements I agree with through and through, not from Peterson's work, just from everything else I've said leading up to that point. Because if you don't find something bigger in your life outside of you to sort of guide your worldview and guide your actions, you will worship something destructive, or something will sort of fall into that place. And a lot of the time, I guess it's yourself, because you're the center of your own universe, aren't you? Your feelings, your thoughts are like the primary thing in view when you're going around in the world.
Yeah, to add a bit more, I think we have a choice to worship something, and so you want to pick something to worship that's better than others. Now, there's this thing called Pascal's wager, which is basically a 2x2 grid. And on the left side, you have believe and don't believe. And at the top of the grid, you have God exists and God doesn't exist. And Pascal basically fills out the grid and he says, okay, if you believe in God, and God exists, then you get eternal bliss. But if you don't believe in God, and God does exist, then you're probably screwed. You get in hell, and you're screwed basically. But if you believe and God doesn't exist, well, you don't actually lose anything. There's not anything lost. You probably have a better life even as a result of that. But if you don't believe and God doesn't exist, then nothing is necessarily gained. Maybe like there's anything lost, but there's not anything necessarily gained. And so his conclusion, with filling out all those 4 possibilities, is that it's better to believe than not to believe. The worst that's gonna happen is that nothing's gonna get lost. Whereas if you don't believe and it ends up existing, then you're gonna be screwed in maybe the afterlife or something. But I take this, and I think you can replace God with, I don't know, let's say I want to be an astronaut. If I believe I'm going to be an astronaut and that ends up existing, well, that's brilliant. If I believe and I don't become an astronaut, well, I've still learnt about space and how that process, what that process is like. I've met a couple people. There's something to be gained. I haven't lost anything. If I don't believe I'm going to become an astronaut, and there is the possibility that I could become an astronaut, then I haven't fulfilled my potential. Maybe that's going to manifest unconsciously because I'm no longer going to be willing to want to get good at things. And if I don't believe I'm going to become an astronaut and that doesn't exist, well, I haven't lost anything. So essentially, you need to believe in something because it's better than not believing. And what happens when you don't worship anything and you don't know about it? Well, I saw in your notes about living a toothless life. That's what that is to me, because when you're not worshipping anything, when you're not biting into anything, then that to me is a toothless life. And just to finally finish, there was a really good line in Nietzsche's Gay Science where it was like, when Buddha died, we lived in its echo for years. And that would be another way to just kind of think about this, is maybe God isn't properly dead, but we're now living in an echo. I'll get back to you.
So I've got a lot more to kind of branch out into this, because I think it's deep. This is a deep kind of system of ideas, and it's worth digging into it. And I think it's all around, like, I think it's all around this definition problem of God. And I think that's why, like, if people listen to the podcast regularly, they would think that I'm a very religious person. And I am to a great degree, but I don't follow any typical religion. I don't go through like the worldly rituals. I'm not a Christian or a Muslim or a Sikh or a Buddhist. I have kind of my own relationship with the divine and the mystical that comes from psychology, I guess, mainly. But when you say, let's take the astronaut example, because I think it's great, right? Believing that you could become an astronaut, you could think about that as you have faith in a positive outcome, right? Which is, it's your very specific positive outcome. But if we take away the specificity, believing you could become an astronaut is faith that if you do the work, learn the things, practice the craft, that you could reach that positive outcome. And then I go, well, faith is a very religious word. Believing, like faith in a positive outcome, if we make that vaguer and vaguer and vaguer and vaguer, right, and take out all the specificity of the person and the specific path they want to go down, and there's a belief that we have faith that the universe is, going in a positive direction, that the world is leading to some kind of future positive outcome, that there is good in the world. If you believe in good, if you have faith in good, then you have, is that not just believing in God?